If you had to sum up in one word or phrase what it is that is the biggest challenge in pushing sustainable development forward at this point, what would that be? One big challenge.
Well, I think we must get uncomfortable with poverty. In the case of Africa, I've always said that poverty must not become our comparative advantage. And so we have to make sure that things that affect the poor, everything Our Excellency said, and Excellency, the Minister said, access to education, health, water, sanitation, those things, why must they happen in the future? And so we have to make sure we have a high discount rate on hope and bring that hope faster to the now. And that's the urgency that we face. And that's what we have to do, accelerate development.
Thank you. Excellent. Minister Reem Al Hashimy, your thoughts? That one big challenge in pushing sustainable development forward. How do you sum it up?
I would say, Becky, we lack urgency. And I will be concise. We don't feel like we're running out of time, but we've already run out of time. So if there's one thing I hope for is that we are impatient with what we see and have a deep sense of urgency to move it forward. It's not insurmountable. It's very difficult, but it's not insurmountable.
Thank you. I alluded to the fact that I thought that, there is no time to lose was a hackneyed phrase. We are running out of time is also a hackneyed phrase, and good for you for making that very, very clear. So Ahmed, that one big challenge phrase word to sum up where we are at this point.
Building on what the Minister said, I think our biggest challenge is that we still think this is someone else's problem. It's not our problem. And increasingly, the problems that are left to be dealt with, because we've done well, 50 years, more progress than ever in the history of human existence. So we've done well, but the remaining problems are problems that will affect us all. And if we recognize that, then I think the urgency will begin to come.
Thank you. Well, we have done well over the years, but the metrics suggest that we are really pretty stalled at this point, and the worry is that we are increasingly going backwards. I mean, we do live in a very fractured world, and we live in a very disrupted period now and going forward as well, which is a great worry. All right. Well, let's start with you, sir, if I can. I'm going to get our arms around poverty. We've talked about the sense of urgency and the fact that we still, to Dr. Ahmed's point, we still think it's somebody else's problem. So what are we going to do about it? We all know that funding is key and that public money alone won't cut it. But the big institutions are out there to support the sort of partnerships that we have seen floated around over the years. We also know that those institutions are simply not fit for purpose at this point.
Well, I think if you talk about the global financial architecture, certainly there are a number of things we have to fix. One is we have a high debt problem, so countries can't develop when they are overburdened with debt. And secondly, it's the whole issue around climate change. You know, the global financial architecture or climate finance is not delivering that to many, many countries. So you have progress being made and so many countries are falling behind. In the case of Africa, we lose between $7 and $15 billion a year to climate change. So we got to make sure that we have financing for climate adaptation for that to happen. And the other one that I think it's very critical for us to see is the way in which concessional financing works. Now, I am president of African Development Bank, and I think that the critical thing is I wouldn't say we are not fit for purpose. I think we are driven to achieve impacts very, very quickly. I mean, I was elected president in 2015 for the bank. And when I got there, I told myself that we got to put people at the center of what we do and accelerate development. And we have. I mean, take the case of food. I mean, I don't think God created stomachs to be empty. He created those stomachs to be filled. And so we invested $25 billion in agriculture. We have helped, for example, take Ethiopia. We helped Ethiopia to become self-sufficient in wheat in less than 4 years, to talk of speed. That or scale, that's what you have. You look at access to electricity. Africa still has 600 million people. Her Excellency was just talking about the issue of inequality that we have. But we have at African Development Bank helped close to 30 million people since that time to have access to electricity. Now, myself and President of the World Bank got together with that sense of urgency, and we told her, I said, look, I say, Ajay, it's not about my flag or your flag. Why can't we just band it together and make sure that a continent is given universal access to electricity?
When did you have that conversation?
We had a conversation at the spring meeting in April last year.
And what's happened since?
Well, we decided to launch something called Mission 300. And that Mission 300 was to connect 300 million Africans to electricity by 2030. And we're not doing it alone. We're doing it with African governments, with philanthropics, Rockefeller Foundation, Global Energy Partnership for People and the Planet, and several others. So we just came back from, we were in Tanzania. And we had 26 heads of state and governments, everybody there, not talking, but agreeing to compacts that will ensure that we have universal access to electricity. And I'll say one more thing here about why we need to have an urgency. I mean, take the case of clean cooking, right? So people take access to clean cooking as for granted around the world. But in Africa, you know, we lose 300 million people. I mean, 300,000 women every year for trying to cook a decent meal. And they put their babies on their back, they lose 300,000 kids. It makes no sense. And so we said we have to make sure that women in Africa are given decent cooking, good life. There's no reason why they should be dying for trying to cook a meal. And so I think, though, that we need to accelerate, I will make this case, financing, concessional financing for development.
Right.
So in the African Development Bank case, we've been able to raise our capital when I started from $93 billion to $308 billion. We are using that money to give firepower for education, for infrastructure, but also making sure that we can support countries to manage their economies better.
And the work you've been doing should be absolutely applauded and will be by the people in this room, and yet so much more needs
to be done.
To happen.
Absolutely.
We've got members of the business and philanthropic community here who've been working extremely hard to provide some sort of catalytic finance.
If I may just say something on the catalytic
Where's the
finance.
private sector?
Yeah, the private sector
What's missing here?
So
What's
take,
missing
for example, you have global capital, assets under management of roughly $145 trillion. And so why is only 1% of that actually coming into Africa, for example? And Africa also has $2.5 trillion of assets under management, you know, by pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and so on. Why aren't we able to get that into all this critical infrastructure thing? That's what we did at African Development Bank. We got together. We created something called the Africa Investment Forum that brings together global capital to meet infrastructure needs of Africa. And we started in 2018. Since that time to now, we've actually mobilized over $225 billion at scale. So private capital, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds are very important, but we have to de-risk that to make it easier for them to invest.
We hear this time and time again, of course. I'm sorry, we're set up so I can't see you guys particularly well. So, Reem, you and I will just sit on the corners of our seat. Look, Reem, let me bring you back in, Minister, if I can, and then Sir, I'll bring you in. You said at the beginning of this, we are running out of excuses about reforming the current multilateral institutions. You say there is, you know, a lack of a sense of urgency. You've just listened to our esteemed guest here. You know, your thoughts when it comes to these funding gaps, if you will.
So I think there's a combination of challenges that don't only include the funding piece. I actually truly believe that the way we're going to address this, almost the easiest part is the money. We need, because there's plenty of money there, as we've heard very clearly from the African Development Bank, but it's not channeled in mechanisms and in ways that are targeted and localized to very regional spaces. And here I would say the answer is going to be less on large global efforts with respect to all of those who represent large multilaterals, but much more on regional and focused institutions that have the level of expertise, the level of attention, and also that level of urgency because they're in where it needs to happen. When you're too high up, you're too far away from what actually needs to be done. And the number of times we've spoken about changes that need to be seen at the IFC and at the World Bank level is too many to be repeated yet again, and I won't insult the intelligence of the audience or of my fellow panelists, because there's just far too many issues and trying to unlock those. So where we're looking at in the UAE is really how do you find localized solutions by empowering institutions that are from that region and can serve that region well, such as the work that the African Development Bank is doing.
Can you talk a little bit more about that work here then? And when we talk about, getting sort of some institutions on a more local and regional level, we have talked about this for some time. We talk about a sense of urgency now. So how quickly can we effect those operations to ensure that we can get things done? But I think talking about some of the granular work that's being done here would be really useful.
So let's talk a little bit from the humanitarian side, and then I will match both humanitarian and development nexuses. On the humanitarian side, we've seen that empowering local communities through existing civil society organizations just has far greater ripple effect in creating a sense of solidarity and stability in any said community than if we were to route things via New York or Geneva. As important as New York and Geneva are, we get a much better understanding of program design when we're talking, like in Tanzania, to what's happening in, for example, Mombasa. Mm-hmm. However, what we have also found as a clear challenge is how do you bring the technical capabilities up to par with some of these smaller organizations? And that's where your donor usually uses the excuse of not getting engaged because the technical capability isn't matched. On the development front, I'm going to point to my colleague Bedr Jafar, who is the special envoy for the minister in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for Business and Philanthropy. Without unlocking what the business and philanthropic institutions have to join us as a shareholder, not stakeholder, but shareholder in some of the progress we need to see in the developing world, we're never, ever going to make it. Because there is a distrust in institutions in general, and that's been growing. And there is a need to see other people who have, quote, skin in the game. And the private sector, just like the First Lady showed us in Lab for All, they get involved because they see how that directly impacts how any type of humanitarian or development program on the ground impacts their purse strings directly. So I would push on what you said in the very beginning, Becky, on innovation. We tend to think innovation has to do with technology. But innovation is just changing the way you've traditionally done something in a different way. And that demands imagination and courage. And we need to stop repeating our talking points and really push ourselves to do things in an imaginative and an innovative way. And the private sector is very well versed in that.
Yep, absolutely. And I'm so pleased that you brought that up at this point. Ahmed, let me bring you in here with your sort of lens through the Centre for Global Development. We're talking here about impact and measuring impact, ensuring that it is clear where there is some return on investment. I don't mean that in a sort of true sort of financial sense, but it's much bigger than that, isn't it? Data, analytics, how do we use AI and advanced technology to ensure that the work that's getting done on the ground is having a real impact? Your view?
So I think there are the two things that I would say to that, Becky. First thing, I think we just need to remember the majority of what determines outcomes over 10 or 20 years or 30 years is what happens within each country. What happens in the rest of the world is helpful or not so helpful, but ultimately what drives progress, and when you see differential progress, it's from within each country. And so when Akin was saying, look, there's all this African asset holders, sovereign wealth funds and the like, that are holding their money and investing it outside the continent, part of the answer is to help them de-risk it, but the bigger solution is going to be to help the countries actually identify why those asset holders are not investing there. It's the rule of law, it's the macro stability. So getting the fundamentals right within really does matter, and I think that'll have an impact on whatever the outcome is. The second thing I think we should say is that, we really are right now at a moment of inflection in international development cooperation. This is not a bubble. This is a change in the way in which the international development and finance architecture is going to work over the next 10 years. Everyone has been following what's been happening as a consequence of the freezing of funding from USAID and other
Correct.
US sources. And every day you see the stories, the consequences. But European donors have all of them pretty much cut back their development spending by between 30 and 50%. And you can go through the list and see the numbers. And the remainder is being reallocated towards mutual interest as the defining framework. And I think one of the lessons from that to come back to your point about impact, is that I believe we are coming now into an era of focusing on the essentials. There's going to be less funding available. There's going to be a greater need to demonstrate value added for every dollar or euro that you spend. And therefore, focusing on where the impact is greatest is going to be key. And that will mean not just putting in place better metrics and better measurement, but it also means, sweeping away some of the things that we have put in as taboo. You mentioned, Reem, the idea of why not have the philanthropies or the private sector sit not as stakeholders, but as shareholders. Akin has a multilateral development bank that he runs, the African Bank. Why don't we have a mechanism where philanthropies are actually in the system as shareholders putting money in? Akin and the Inter-American Development Bank have been going around for 2 years trying to get some money from the SDRs that were allocated, invested as hybrid capital. But in the end, the money that you've been able to mobilize is actually as much coming from other sources. And I think we need to find ways where we break down some of these things that have existed, because the world will no longer, we know that the system that we have is not delivering the outcomes we want.
Akin.
Yeah, no, actually, let me come back to what the minister was saying about getting down to where the action really is. We can try to have all the changes in the global financial architecture. So it's like trying to change a house in which the plumbing is still the same, right? The SDGs that Our Excellency mentioned actually happens in communities. They happen in local governments. They happen at a subnational level. They don't happen at a national level. And so a lot of the financing that we give is at a national level. And so you are assuming that somehow that's going to filter down there. I think at the global financial institutions, you take that lesson and make sure that we are developing or actually deploying our resources to where things are. So take, for example, the subnationals. We will say the subnationals don't have the capacity to absorb the resources, but it's a chicken and egg game, because we never build their capacity. So why is it that we cannot build their capacity to generate their own resources, to have credit ratings, to have the capacity, fiduciary capacity to manage their resources, and we deploy money there? And so we started something working with African mayors and making sure that we have instruments that can respond to that. I also want to say something about the issue about the hybrid capital, these SDRs that was mentioned by there. Look, there are not enough resources around. And so we have to squeeze the most out of the oranges we have. Now, but we get too locked into instruments. It's not instruments that changes the world. It's how you adapt your instruments to changing contexts. So the special drawing rights, for example, we have $650 billion of that were issued by the IMF. Africa, for example, got no more than $33 billion of that, very, very small. But myself, as Mahmoud said, and the president of Inter-American Development Bank got together and said, look, we have a financial model that will help to make sure that the SDRs that are issued, that we can actually, with our AAA ratings, turn that into 8x. So if you give $100 billion to the multilateral development banks, that becomes $800 billion. Okay, it's still far away from what we want to do. Your Excellency, the UN Secretary General, I told the UN Secretary General, if we did $500 billion of SDRs, You can imagine how many trillions of dollars we are going to have. But somehow we get used to our instruments and we kind of guide them like that. But I'm glad that at least, Mahmoud, that conversation has started. And I think we need to do more to make sure that happens. Last thing I want to say is we can't help countries. Countries have to help themselves. Because development is about pride. And so you've got to be able to mobilize your own resources through domestic resource mobilization. Now, I come from this by saying, people would say in Africa, well, the debt to GDP ratio is high, and therefore you need to raise more fiscal resources via increasing taxes. I'm not against increasing taxes. But look, it's a social contract between societies and their people. And so if I am providing electricity for myself, I am providing security for myself, my social insurance for myself, I'm building my roads for myself because of government failure, we can't have that. So the point I want to make here is this. Let's also talk about public accountability, national accountability for the resources that we have. If we govern those resources well, if we use them well, and we make sure that we are a social contract with societies to provide education, water, sanitation, health, we are going to have a better world. So it comes down to governments have to have accountability for meeting SDGs and the poverty that we see today.
That sense of urgency, and I hear what you're saying, and I see Reem sort of writing sort of rapidly there, and I'm going to come to you. I just have to ask you, Masood made a very good point. We're at a moment of inflection in international development. We are in what feels like a very different era at present. And to be quite frank and open about it, I'm not going to avoid the elephant in the room. The US administration does not feel like it is an administration that is going to care about international development. It is not giving that impression at the moment. How concerned are you? Go, both of you.
I just have my chance, so let Mahmoud go first, I come after him, so just to be fair.
Look, the US is the biggest provider of development assistance in the world, right? And it provides $65 billion of development assistance in the world. If they stop, it's a big number. It has immediate impact. Of course, I'm concerned, even more so are the people who are not able to access the drugs, the medicines, the healthcare that they were being provided through US policy. But the bigger point here is that I see the same kinds of concerns and reservations about development cooperation, not just in the US, but in many other traditional providers. And I think that this says two things. One is it's about what's happening in their own societies, which is for a variety of reasons, we don't have time to get into that. But the other reason is that I think they don't see the impact and the results with the machinery of development that has been created. So I really do feel, to pick up on your point earlier, that the big global machines can do some things, but it is going to be through partnerships, through coalitions, through regional. The days of having the single dominant framework for development cooperation are over, in my view. We are moving to a decade when we're going to have multiple, sometimes overlapping, sometimes not so efficient, not so neat, a little messier, but that's how progress is going to be made. So that's the opportunities is to find where you can put together. And that's where I think this, the project to provide electricity to 300 million people, terrific idea. And we should be doing more of those things in an I don't want to use the term opportunistic, but it's take the opportunity and then exploit it.
And you're right. So go on, Akin.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say that Mahmoud is right, because at the end of the day, it's taxpayers' resources that we all get. So it's important to have efficiency, effectiveness, and use that to have transformative impact. Now, when it comes to the issue of the changes, I know people are kind of worried about President Trump, and I'm not worried, because I don't think that as multilateral development banks, he hasn't said he's going to leave multilateral development banks. He simply said, look, let's have a review of those multilateral development banks and look at how they're working, what are they using resources for, and how they can be reformed to do better. I see nothing wrong in that. And so we expect that within 6 months, and then we'll see. However, this much I would say. I think that aid is good for poor countries that have limited fiscal space, that have a lot of fragility, and that have a lot of poverty. But we shouldn't get used to aid. I haven't seen any nation develop just by aid. Aid is exactly what it is. It's aid. We have to make sure that we move to a model in Africa, for example, where we trade ourselves and invest ourselves into growth and development, not from a dependency perspective, but from a partnership and investment perspective. I'll just give you one good example. One example is take the future of energy transition. Everything you need for that in the world, 90% of the platinum is in Africa. Is it the cobalt? Is it the lithium? Is it the graphite? They're all in Africa. The size of that market in 2030 will be $7 trillion. For electric vehicles, it will be $59 trillion by 2050. So what we've got to do also in Africa is develop via investment, create investment opportunities for private capital to come in to help us unlock our resources. Well, that's in agriculture. Take agriculture. It's a $1 trillion market in Africa. So we need a lot more private capital. And this much I would say, as a multilateral development bank person, that we need to have greater leverage.
Right.
Those countries that are giving us money not only expect us to do well, they also must be looking at how much are you leveraging private capital. Private capital is there. Her Excellency is correct in terms of public-private partnerships. So, that's why I say I'm not worried. I think Mahmoud is right. It's a new world, but that new world requires private sector. It also requires that we have greater efficiency and effectiveness and impact.
Greater efficiency, greater effectiveness on the ground. You want to see more agility, more speed, more effectiveness in responses to what we know. We know what the problems are. You keenly pointed that out in your address at the beginning. So with 3 minutes to go, so that we are only 15 minutes over on this panel, and we haven't even started, I'm going to give you, Minister, if I can, just an opportunity to sort of step back for a moment, consider what we've just heard across this panel over the last sort of half an hour or so, and sum up where you feel we are at and where we might be going forward. We have 5 years, and you have 5 minutes.
I thought I had 3 minutes, so thank you for that. So I would crystallize what I've heard my colleagues and fellow panelists say by asking for 100 other Project 300s, for example. And I think we should be worried because we're not collectively rising to the occasion of providing for 100 versions of Project 300. And until we get comfortable with being uncomfortable, as you pointed out so well, in that one singular global framework, we will continue to almost be comatose in thinking of 2030 like it's right down there, but we're actually living 2030 right now. And so what the UAE has looked at very intently was building these partnerships, and you can see it if you look carefully at everything that we've done, with the big and the small, the traditional and the non-traditional, in comfortable and in uncomfortable ways. And I would encourage and highly and warmly invite versions of Project 300 in all of its forms and fashions to be replicated in other places and in other parts of the world. Challenges are not only in sub-Saharan Africa. There are many, many regions of the world that are struggling and struggling deeply, that don't have a bank like the Africa Development Bank, may I also add, and therefore how we can mobilize, to the very early point you mentioned, a sense of urgency, that this is in our lifetime. The children I referred to when I was on the podium were my kids, who are under the age of 10. So this is the life and the world that they will be seeing. And when I'm not with them, they're hoping that I'm doing something good about the life that they're going to eventually inherit. And so if we could really feel a sense of responsibility, and you had mentioned that as well, and a sense of accountability, that now that we're in this field, what have we done to create those Project 300 versions in other regions in the world? And my nation is good at forging partnerships. It can bring together and convene, just as you've seen here at WGS, can bring people together in ways that would have traditionally not been coming together as well.
And Expo 2020 was a great example of that, and you spearheaded that. And I think there are I'm sure, many lessons to be taken out of that when we are looking at how you sort of mobilize people and capital together. And I think I'm just going to close here by saying, you talked about Project 300 coming out of a conversation that you had with AJ, likely a convened event. Yeah. I think about Expo 2020, I think about COP28, 2 events that we just held here alone, and the events that I've been to just in the past sort of 18 months or so, Davos and various others, all of which have a sort of SDG component behind the scenes. And it seems to me that it's at these events that people get excited, people get mobilized, people put the effort in to sort of, ensure that the platform is used effectively. But is it as effective as it should be? It's a bit like saying, do we really need a COP28 and 2 COP16s in the same year? Why are we doing that? So I just wonder, out of this, when we're talking about, the power of convening, the power of partnerships, which is so evident and so keenly felt here, how do we also ensure that all of these sort of individual events and opportunities that we get to mobilize, there's a way of sort of joining the dots to a degree?
Yeah, it can never be for the sake of convening.
Correct.
It has to keep building on past forums and past platforms. Otherwise, your KPI is kind of bland. It's the number of countries that have presented themselves, the number of heads of state, and that's not what we do here, because that's, frankly, with all humility, that's too little. It needs to be impactful. It needs to have led to the types of conversations which become initiatives, which become programs on the ground in less than 12 months. And we've been part of those types of conversations and discussions where, really, Becky, I've said this so many times, I think you must be bored of me by now, but our greatest enemy is the mindset in which we shackle ourselves into, where we feel we can't move out of a set parameter. And that is simply not true. And if we pushed ourselves and each other to be bold and to be courageous and to be really practical in 2 days to design something, it actually happens.
Well, that's what's called UAE speed. When you live in the UAE, you realize there are 2 things. UAE speed and can do something better tomorrow. And when people come into the UAE, I think certainly from my perspective, they get very exhausted by being here. But I mean this in the best possible way. It does work. Look, we talked about there being an inflection point in international development. I think we would have been wrong not to have discussed the era that we are in and the concerns just 5 years out from these goals, the concerns that I think many people in this room will share about where we are headed. But out of crisis comes opportunity. So is this not, and I will leave us with what I think has been a very inspiring discussion today, and thank you all for this, but are we not at a point at which we can genuinely say, faced with the challenges which are clear out there, and it isn't just the US. Every G7 country is carrying an enormous amount of debt to GDP at the moment. It's a horrible situation. How do we carve out opportunities and work together? And with that, I will leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.